Have you ever looked at a painting so famous that it seems to live forever, while the life of the person inside it faded far too soon? Such is the haunting paradox of Infanta Margarita Teresa of Spain, the radiant young princess immortalized by Diego Velázquez in his masterpiece Las Meninas, yet destined to die at just 21. In art, she is eternal, a delicate child standing at the center of one of the most celebrated canvases in Western history. Her blonde hair, her white dress trimmed with silver, and her curious gaze have captivated millions for centuries. In reality, however, her life was marked by frailty, duty, and the crushing weight of dynastic expectations. Margarita Teresa was born in 1651, during the golden yet troubled age of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. Her father, King Philip IV of Spain, presided over a vast but declining empire. Spain still held lands stretching across Europe and the Americas, yet within its borders, power was weakening and the burdens of rule were heavy. The Spanish court in Madrid was a place of rigid ceremony and deep Catholic devotion. Daily life revolved around etiquette, religion, and the constant shadow of politics. Yet in this strict and often suffocating environment, little Margarita stood out. She was lively, intelligent, and adored by her family. To King Philip, she was not only a daughter, but also a symbol of continuity in a dynasty plagued by illness and inbreeding. But for the rest of the world, Margarita would first be known through Velázquez's brush. At just 5 years old, she became the luminous subject of Las Meninas, painted in 1656. In the masterpiece, she appears at the center, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, dwarfs, and the painter himself, while the adults stand in deference. The child princess commands attention with her innocence and grace. She is both a girl and a queen-in-waiting, a figure caught between childhood and destiny. What makes the story so striking is that the world remembers Margarita most vividly from this frozen moment in time, a young girl who seems full of promise. Yet behind the canvas, her reality was already being shaped by the heavy hand of politics. Her future had been decided before she could even understand it. She would be married to her uncle, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, in order to strengthen the Habsburg bloodline. It was a destiny that seemed royal, but in truth, it was a life filled with sickness, sacrifice, and sorrow. The radiant child in Las Meninas would grow into a fragile woman, forced to endure multiple pregnancies that drained her health. By 21, the same girl who once embodied vitality and promise was gone, her body broken by the very duties imposed on her as a Habsburg princess. The irony is inescapable. Margarita Teresa lives forever in art, frozen in eternal youth, while her real life was cut short by illness and exhaustion. But who exactly was this princess beyond the canvas? What was her childhood like within the gilded but suffocating walls of the Spanish court? To understand Infanta Margarita Teresa, one must step inside the intricate web of family, politics, and culture that defined her world. She was not just a royal child. She was a daughter of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, a family whose power once spanned continents but whose survival increasingly depended on fragile bloodlines and strategic marriages. Margarita was born in Madrid in 1651. The first child of King Philip Roman IV and his second wife, Mariana of Austria. Philip, already in his mid-40s, had endured the loss of several children from his first marriage, leaving the continuation of the dynasty uncertain. Margarita's birth was celebrated with great relief and hope. She was the living proof that the royal line still endured. Her childhood unfolded within the Alcázar of Madrid, the royal palace that once stood where the Grand Palacio Real now rises. The Alcázar was both magnificent and suffocating, endless chambers decorated with tapestries and paintings, and corridors bound by strict rules of etiquette. Every gesture, every word, every movement of the young princess was carefully observed. Even as a child, she was never free from the weight of expectations. Yet within this rigid world, Margarita was beloved. Descriptions from her contemporaries paint a picture of a charming, lively girl with striking blonde hair and fair skin, a reflection of her Habsburg lineage. She had a playful spirit, but also a sense of dignity far beyond her years. Her father doted on her, calling her his joy, while her mother and tutors ensured she was raised in deep Catholic devotion. as befitted a Spanish princess. But family in the Habsburg dynasty was never only about affection, it was about survival. The Habsburgs, rulers of both Spain and Austria, had long practiced intermarriage between close relatives to keep their vast empire united. This practice, however, brought devastating consequences: generations of inherited illnesses, deformities, and fragile health. Margarita herself was born into this genetic burden, even as she grew into a radiant young woman. Whispers of her delicate health followed her. Meanwhile, the cultural world around her blossomed. Margarita grew up surrounded by Spain's Siglo de Oro, its golden age of art and literature. The walls of the Alcázar displayed the masterpieces of Velázquez, Rubens, and Titian. Writers like Calderón de la Barca entertained the court with poetry and plays, and amid this splendor, Margarita became a muse. Velazquez, the great court painter, captured her image multiple times, presenting her as both a child of innocence and a future queen. But behind these portraits lay an inescapable truth: Margarita's future was never her own. From birth, she was destined to marry her uncle, Leopold I of Austria, strengthening the alliance between Madrid and Vienna. To the court, she was not simply a daughter or a princess, she was a political promise. A human bridge between two thrones. As she grew older, this destiny began to shape her life in painful ways. The little girl adored by Spain as the star of Las Meninas was slowly molded into a symbol of dynastic survival. The vibrant spirit seen on Velázquez's canvas would be tested by duty, illness, and the crushing responsibilities of her role. And so the stage was set, a radiant princess adored by her family and immortalized in art. Yet bound to a fate written long before she could choose. But how did this young girl, forever remembered as a child in Las Meninas, step into the harsh reality of adulthood, marriage, and duty? What turning point would transform her life from promise to tragedy? As the radiant child of Las Meninas grew into womanhood, the world around her began to close in. Infanta Margarita Teresa had always been more than a daughter, more than a princess. She was the living key to the survival of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. And when she came of age, that burden became impossible to escape. From the time she was a child, her fate had been sealed. She would marry her maternal uncle, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, a man nearly twice her age. The marriage was not a choice born of affection, but of politics. The Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs were desperate to preserve their power, and Margarita was the bridge that would bind them together. At the age of 15, she left Spain for Vienna, leaving behind the palace where Velázquez had painted her, the family who adored her, and the country where she had been a cherished symbol. The journey was long, exhausting, and heavy with symbolism. Spain was sending its most precious jewel to Austria, hoping to secure a future for a dynasty already crumbling under the weight of inbreeding and decline. In Vienna, she became Empress consort of the Holy Roman Empire, the youngest empress in Europe. But while the title seemed grand, the reality was far from a fairy tale. Leopold cared for her, but their union was overshadowed by the relentless demand for heirs. Margarita's body, still delicate and frail from her Habsburg lineage, was forced into a cycle of repeated pregnancies. Between 1666 and 1673, she gave birth 6 times. 4 of her children died in infancy, a tragic but common fate in royal Europe. Each pregnancy left her weaker, her health deteriorating rapidly. Letters she sent back to Spain revealed a young woman overwhelmed by duty. Longing for the warmth of her childhood home in Madrid, her words carried a tone of exhaustion, a cry for relief that would never come. By her early 20s, Margarita's once vibrant spirit had dimmed. The golden-haired child immortalized by Velázquez had become a pale and weary young woman, her body broken by childbirth and illness. In March 1673, at just 21 years old, she died in Vienna. Most likely from complications of her final pregnancy combined with the genetic weaknesses that plagued her family. Her death was devastating. To Leopold, she was not only an empress but also a niece and a wife. To Spain, she was the daughter of their king, a princess whose life had embodied both beauty and sorrow. And to the world, she became yet another symbol of the tragic destiny of the Habsburgs, a dynasty cursed by its own obsession with purity and power. The cruelest irony remains. While Margarita's real life was marked by suffering, exhaustion, and an early grave, her painted image continues to radiate vitality. On Velázquez's canvas, she will always be a child of promise, untouched by the weight of duty, unbroken by illness. The canvas froze her at her brightest moment, while time and history carried her into tragedy. Her short life, juxtaposed against her eternal presence in Las Meninas, forces us to ask, which is more powerful, art that preserves an illusion or reality that tells a harsher truth? The death of Infanta Margarita Teresa in 1673, at just 21, ripples through two empires. For Spain, she had been the beloved daughter of King Philip Roman IV, a living reminder of the glory days of the Spanish Habsburgs. For Austria, she had been the young Empress whose marriage symbolized the unbreakable bond between Vienna and Madrid. Her passing was not only a personal tragedy, it was a dynastic wound. In Vienna, Emperor Leopold I was devastated. Their marriage may have begun as political necessity, but it had grown into genuine affection. Letters from the court describe Leopold as inconsolable, a ruler mourning both his wife and the fragile hope she had carried for the Habsburg line. She had given birth to 6 children, but only one daughter, Archduchess Maria Antonia, survived infancy. This left the Austrian court anxious. Dynastic continuity remained precarious. In Spain, the grief was layered with symbolism. Margarita had been immortalized as a child in Las Meninas, the luminous centerpiece of Velázquez's masterpiece. To many Spaniards, she was not just a princess, but a cultural icon. News of her death spread quickly, and sorrow was felt not only in the court, but also among the people who had adored her image in paintings, engravings, and stories. For them, the little Infanta frozen in art would always remain youthful and full of promise, while reality had robbed her of adulthood. Her passing also deepened the sense of fatalism surrounding the Habsburg dynasty. Generations of intermarriage had produced rulers plagued with weak health, infertility, and early deaths. Margarita herself, the product of this genetic entanglement, had embodied both the splendor and the fragility of her family. To many observers, her death seemed to confirm the decline of a once mighty house. Within decades, the Spanish Habsburg line would vanish entirely, replaced by the Bourbons. Yet amidst the sorrow, Margarita's image took on new life in the cultural imagination. Writers and poets described her as a tragic heroine, a princess who had been both adored and sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. In art, her portraits by Velázquez and later Juan Bautista Martínez del Mazo became more than family keepsakes. They became relics of a vanished world, embodying innocence lost and promise unfulfilled. Ordinary people, too, found in her story a reflection of their own struggles. While they could never relate to palaces or crowns, they understood sickness, exhaustion, and the grief of losing young lives. In this way, Margarita became not only a royal figure, but also a mirror of the universal human condition, the cruelty of fate, the fragility of health, the cost of duty. The response of both courts, Spain and Austria, underscored just how fragile dynastic politics had become. Spain lost a daughter, Austria lost a young empress. Both saw in her death the weakening of their shared future. But beyond the calculations of alliances and power, the world remembered her for something far more enduring, the haunting image of a child forever preserved in one of the most celebrated paintings in history. Still, her story did not end with her death. Through her surviving daughter Maria Antonia, and through the cultural afterlife of Las Meninas, Margarita's legacy would continue to shape European history. But what exactly did Spain and Europe learn from her short life and premature death? And how does her legacy continue to echo through art and history even today? When we look back at the brief, fragile life of Infanta Margarita Teresa, what remains is not just the memory of a young woman who died at 21, but a tapestry of lessons and legacies that continue to resonate centuries later. Her story reminds us of the human cost of dynastic politics. Born into the powerful Habsburg family, Margarita was never free to choose her destiny from the moment she entered the world. Her body and her future belonged to political strategy. Her marriage to Leopold I was designed not for love, but to preserve power. And yet in that forced union, we glimpse the resilience of a young woman who managed to balance duty with moments of tenderness. Her life teaches us about the sacrifices demanded by power and the vulnerability hidden beneath royal crowns. Another enduring lesson lies in the tragedy of genetic inheritance. The Habsburgs, obsessed with preserving their dynasty through intermarriage, created a fragile line plagued by disease and early death. Margarita's own exhaustion from repeated childbirth, coupled with her delicate constitution, illustrates the devastating consequences of such practices. Her death was not only personal but symbolic of a dynasty heading toward extinction. The fall of the Spanish Habsburgs at the dawn of the 18th century stands as a stark warning about the dangers of short-sighted ambition. Yet Margarita's legacy is not only one of decline, it is also one of immortality through art. Thanks to Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas, she exists eternally as a vibrant, curious child surrounded by attendants, dogs, and even the shadow of her parents reflected in a distant mirror. The painting captures her at the height of innocence, untouched by the burdens of adulthood. Every visitor to the Prado Museum in Madrid who gazes upon Las Meninas unknowingly meets her, the princess whose life was cut short but whose image never fades. This duality, art versus reality, forms the heart of Margarita's enduring significance. On canvas, she is timeless. In history, she is tragic together. They remind us of the power of art to preserve moments that life cannot sustain. Without Velázquez, Margarita might have been a footnote in dynastic history. With him, she became an icon, a symbol of youth, beauty, and the fleeting nature of existence. Her surviving daughter, Maria Antonia, carried forward a fragment of her bloodline, though even this continuation would eventually be absorbed into the Bourbon dynasty. In this way, Margarita's personal story intertwines with the greater shifts of European history, her life and death marking both the twilight of one dynasty and the birth of another. And beyond politics and painting, her story carries a deeper, universal message, that even those born into the highest stations are not immune to the struggles of health, duty, and fate. She reminds us that behind every royal portrait is a human life, fragile, complex, and fleeting. Today, when we stand before Las Meninas, we are not just admiring a masterpiece of perspective and technique. We are meeting a young woman whose life was filled with hope, duty, and sorrow. We are reminded that beauty does not last, that power cannot shield us from mortality, but that memory, preserved through art, story, and reflection, can endure far longer than flesh and blood. But how should we end her story, after all? History remembers her not only for who she was, but for what she symbolizes: the fragility of dynasties, the immortality of art, and the eternal human yearning to be remembered. The story of Infanta Margarita Teresa is both brief and eternal. In life, she walked the gilded halls of Madrid and Vienna, burdened by the weight of her dynasty, celebrated as a child of promise and broken by the relentless demands of duty. In death, she became a symbol of fragility, a young empress consumed by the very system that sought to preserve her family's power. Yet paradoxically, her presence has outlived the empires she was meant to strengthen. While the Spanish Habsburgs vanished into history, Margarita endures on canvas, in stories, and in memory. Each brushstroke of Velázquez's Las Meninas immortalized her, capturing not just her likeness, but the spirit of a world that no longer exists. There is something haunting in this dual legacy. On the one hand, she is a real young woman whose life was defined by sacrifice, exhaustion, and an early grave. On the other, she is an eternal child, preserved in art as if untouched by time. The tension between these two Margaritas, the living, suffering woman and the painted, immortal girl, forces us to ask a deeper question: which version is more real? Perhaps that is the power of history. It reminds us that the stories we inherit are never whole, that truth often lies in the spaces between memory and myth. Margarita's reality was fleeting, but her myth endures, and in that endurance, she achieves a kind of immortality denied to most. For modern eyes, her life is a reminder of the universal truths that transcend centuries: the vulnerability of the human body, the destructive cost of unchecked ambition, and the way art can outlast even the strongest dynasties. Her tragedy is not just a relic of the past, it echoes in the present, warning us about the dangers of sacrificing individuals to the weight of systems larger than themselves. And yet, despite the sorrow, her story is also strangely comforting. To stand before Las Meninas today is to share a silent connection with a girl who lived 3.5 centuries ago. We meet her gaze, we feel her presence, and in that moment, time collapses. She is gone, but she is not lost. So we close this story not with an ending, but with an open question. Was Margarita Teresa truly just a victim of her dynasty's decline, or has she, through art and memory, achieved a far greater destiny than her family ever intended? But then again, is that truly the whole story of the girl forever frozen in Las Meninas?